Thank you, David, for that kind introduction. And it is a real privilege to be with you this evening to talk about what is an enormously important subject. First of all, I'd just like to say thanks to you, David, and to the Rockefeller family over the course of the last century who have dedicated themselves to making all of us better as a country, and that you obviously lead and are incredibly important in continuing that legacy and continuing to make a difference. And we are all very grateful for that. When I was asked to speak and to look at the subject of resiliency, actually, while I have my own definition of what that is, one of the first things I did, having discussed it a great deal over the course of the last several years, was I actually looked it up in the dictionary, because like so many things, it can be so many things to so many people. And I found the words of an ability, as I understand. In fact, it was a 1973 Webster's Dictionary that I happened to, and I'm not totally out of touch with the current media, but I had it close at hand, and I was struck by the fact that it said something like the ability to absorb a shock without being deformed and without being ruptured. And then it said, and to do so easily. And I found that very insightful, because I think the term easily is certainly a challenge in the current world. I actually then went up on Wikipedia to see what the current definition was, and actually little has changed. I know you focus on innovation. I did the same thing in innovation, and actually it was a wonderfully simple definition of innovation, which is to just introduce something new. I've been involved in innovation and those who think they innovate for a long time, and that can also be much more complex than that simple definition. I thought your focus on social, economic, and environment was incredibly important, and how do you underpin both change and resilience and innovation in those particular areas. I have been in a leadership position for some time, and I worked hard to lead change, and I think that leading change is as challenging in terms of leadership as anything that we do. And the way I've described it to those that I'm involved with is, you better figure out how to embrace change, because if you don't, it will certainly embrace you. And I would argue that it is not just leading in a time of change, but leading in a time of change which is accelerating. And that has become the norm. So how do we do that? And certainly for those of us in the military, and actually as a country, and in many ways in the world, the last 10 years have provided plenty of shocks. And if I were to start at 9/11, and actually in retrospect, I am struck by the resilience that we had as a country. We had in so many ways, when you consider the devastation that occurred that day, that had been built up knowingly or unknowingly in terms of our ability to both respond to it. Certainly after that, the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq. What was also particularly instructive to me was the tsunami in '04 in Indonesia, and the devastation which occurred there. And it's the first time in a crisis that one of the commanders out there who I talked to after it was over reminded me that we need to pay a lot of attention, not just to the victims in these circumstances, but also the caregivers who were put in extreme situations, which I have subsequently seen in other devastations, whether it was Katrina in '05 or in Haiti or with the oil spill or out in Japan. And I'd also put in the upheaval in the Middle East, as well as the '08 crash in our own country. So there's been plenty of shocks to the system over the course of the last 10 years. And from my perspective, for whatever reason, and it's pretty difficult to know this, but for whatever reason, they seem to be occurring at a pace that heretofore they have not occurred, which then gets us to the importance of what you very specifically are focused on, and that is how do you build the resilience to handle the future. When I think about leading in these times, in a time of change, and this is actually, this goes back from my perspective to how I grew up, why I stayed in the military, being around such incredible people. It really is principally a focus on people, whether it's those that are affected or those who will, in fact, make the change. I also try and have learned as a senior leader to stay focused on the principles. And so when you're in a situation where things are changing so rapidly, the principles when things are changing from a leadership standpoint are a sense of urgency, at least from my perspective, a sense of urgency, a vision that you can articulate and lay out there, a strategy, how do I communicate all of that? In particular, how do I focus on the culture? My culture, the culture of those who are affected, whether they're in my own country or whether it is a global audience or another country, which it is so often. How do I see challenges through their eyes? Many of you know that I've spent an extraordinary amount of time in Pakistan. I went to Pakistan a lot. It's an enormously complex country, maybe the most complex country in the world. But in great part, I went to listen, to try to understand their challenges from their perspective, and I tried to do that in an awful lot of venues. I work from a leadership standpoint to try to empower those who would make good things happen. And then I'm not sure it's the most important, but it's right up there, is how do I stay current with the facts on the ground? I'm fighting 2 wars over the course of the last 10 years. I'm chairman for 4 of those years. And I will tell you that I would lead change in the military in how we were doing things most often by an update on what is actually happening on the ground, whether it's in villages in Afghanistan, whether it's in cities in Iraq, or whether it's on the home front, when myself and more frequently my wife would sit down with spouses who have been through an extraordinary amount in their own families. And that I had an ability with those facts, if you will, to then update how we were approaching it from the leadership standpoint. And I think organizationally, that's an incredibly important part of everything that we do in order to get the leadership thing right. Specifically, to apply some of these principles, what I saw, certainly over the course of these wars, was a sense of urgency, and I talked about that earlier. But life and death really brings a huge sense of urgency. Barriers drop immediately. People who didn't even talk to each other start talking to each other and looking for ways to solve problems. And so the challenges, and oftentimes that creates opportunity for top-down leadership. And changes that I saw that were directly related to this in these wars were in the medical field, where we led, where it's night and day on the battlefield right now, where essentially we put in medical capability throughout Iraq and throughout Afghanistan so that, and you've seen this, anybody that was wounded could get, and we could get them to the right medical care level within an hour. Some 95% of them survived the wars, no matter how challenging and how tragic the wounds were. Identified, certainly the signature wounds of these wars have been the amputations, and the medical community and really the systems writ large who put in investments, who put in training, who essentially approached this from a systemic point of view to make a difference in these young people's lives who'd sacrificed so much. We've come a long way on the physical side of these wounds. We still have a long way to go on the mental side. David, you mentioned understanding the connection between the heart and the brain. I have been taken back at how little we understand about the brain. I just didn't know that. And those that are involved in certainly the brain in terms of medicine and research would understand that. I just didn't know that. And so we have a huge way to go with respect to that. Again, this sense of urgency, how do leaders approach it when you have it? Bob Gates led an effort to provide protection for troops on the ground in the vehicles that they needed, and got the U.S. government to spend upwards of $26 billion virtually overnight to provide vehicles in the field that would save that saved an enormous number of lives, both in Iraq and Afghanistan. It would take years to get that done without that sense of urgency and that sort of unity of belief across every facet of government that we needed to do this as rapidly as possible. We've changed and led in what I call the speed of war. We talk about speed of communications. We were way behind with respect to that. We needed to not just catch up with the enemy, but also get ahead of it. And we've been able to do that through technology and through leadership. We've fundamentally changed who we are as a force, from a conventional force to a counterinsurgency force. There are arguments on both sides of that, but that's what we had to do in the moment, if you will, and become, from my perspective, the best military that our country has ever seen. We've had huge challenges, not just with our military members, but also stress on our families. So what lessons did I learn about resilience in these wars? And I'd just like to point out a couple of them. And I'll focus on the Army, but there's also an applicable lesson with the Marine Corps. These are the two forces that certainly have borne the brunt of these wars. With respect to the Army was not a deploying force when these wars started. They went to Afghanistan for about 6 months, to Iraq in '03 when the war started there. But subsequent to that, they deployed for 12 months and 12 months and 15 months and 12 months, which is the same cycle that they're on right now. And in many of these units, the major units, if you were a 5-year-old boy or girl when this war started, essentially you're now 15 or 16 years old, and your whole conscious life as a child in this family has been at war. It's put an extraordinary amount of stress on families, on spouses, and they have been unbelievably resilient in what they have been able to get through. It's not an inexhaustible supply of resilience. Certainly we have asked them to do a great deal, but they've been exceptionally good in terms of the resilience that they have shown, as has our Army, in terms of what we've asked them to do to fight these wars. The same is true, if I was going to focus on the officer side, if you were a 2002 graduate of West Point, you essentially have been at war for your entire commissioned life. And as you look forward, and this is a challenge as we develop people, as you look forward to the future, you see no end in sight in terms of the number of deployments and what you have to do. We've taken significant steps to put in systems and support to address the issues of mental health, of post-traumatic stress. We're vastly short of mental health professionals, as is the country. We've sought the best medicine available in the country, not just within the Department of Defense, and that isn't easy because our docs think they're the best. You'd want docs to think that way, but sometimes there are actually capabilities in the country that can help us, and from a bureaucracy standpoint, a leadership standpoint, you have to fight through to try and make that happen as well. And what I learned about resilience in that is, for the Army, what we did initially is we just focused on one thing, and that was get them deployed. Then we focused on the next step, which was redeploy them back. Then we focused on the next step, which was reintegrate them, and there's a lot of work that had to do with that because they hadn't been deployed before. They'd been in combat, and there's an awful lot of things that were associated with that. Then we focused on training them to get them ready to go again, and then we would start the cycle. But what we did is we learned this piece by piece, as opposed to look at the whole system. And quite frankly, what I took away from this in the end was we really needed to start building resilience the moment you come into the military. Day one for you and for your families. And almost half the force is married now. Long gone are the days where very few were married, less than 10%. So we've got to pay a lot more attention to our families in terms of building resilience as well. And what I take away from that is you have to look at the system. You have to look at the relationships between various parts of the whole system to engage and train and build resilience across the board, not in any individual part. And it took us a while to figure that out. The next area that I talk about that I learned about resilience in was the tragedy in Haiti. And I talked about '04, and Cheryl Mills is here tonight, and if there are any questions on Haiti that I can't answer, Cheryl actually can answer those questions. And as an extraordinary, I've watched Cheryl, who works for an extraordinary woman as well, who've made a huge, huge difference, not just in Haiti, but in many, many places. What happened there obviously was completely out of the blue, certainly the amount of the devastation that was there. But what I found in Haiti, and I think this is something that we need to think about, what I found in Haiti was an incredibly resilient people, an incredibly resilient culture. It's spiritual in nature, it's inspirational in nature, and this would be difficult to do, but how do you think about how you're going to help them with respect to the tragedy they've been through and align it with their culture, not the United States culture, if we had 250,000 people killed, the American culture. And I think there's a lot there because we have a tendency to sort of rush in as if it were us, and sometimes we overdo it with respect to that. There are a finite number of things you need in a crisis like that, whether it's there, whether it was in Banda Aceh, or whether, quite frankly, it was in Japan. Do you have, how are you going to get the medical care there? How are you going to get the food there? What's the situation with water? How about shelter? There's a logistics requirement that obviously is part of this as well. And one of the things that David mentioned, and I think a lot of this has got to be based on principles, but it's the whole issue of trust. And I had met Matt Spitzer, who's the head of Doctors Without Borders, a couple of years before Haiti occurred. And once Haiti occurred, Doctors Without Borders is trying to fly airplanes into Haiti. We had control of the airport. The U.S. military had control of the airport, and we were, because we didn't have them on the schedule, they were just showing up. And essentially, they were not able to land. And Spitzer had on his desk, it seemed, a key on his keyboard that every time we would deny a flight into Haiti, he'd punch it, and a story would appear on the front page of the New York Times. That was not a successful strategy for me. We're all trying to get medical help there. But because I had met him a couple years before, I felt very comfortable calling him, and in a very short period of time, we were able to work this out, get him scheduled, get his care in. And this gets to both a trust issue and a relationship issue, and it's a relationship before the crisis, quite frankly, which we need to think through. We're not going to get all of them right, but we have an opportunity. We know who's typically involved in these things. We know where the vulnerabilities are, and if there's a way we can work those kind of relationships to build some trust up, whether it's between the military and Doctors Without Borders or other organizations, it really is I think to our great advantage. I was also taken back then, as I was flowing a lot of stuff to Haiti and trying to get it there, I was taken back that the first salvage and rescue team on the ground 33 hours after the earthquake was from China. They flew them out of Beijing. Now I'm trying to get them out of LA, I'm trying to get them out of, you name the city in my own country, and somehow China, and it was the only team they had, but I'm telling you, they got it there, and it was globally in the media right away, and it had a big impact. And the other thing that happened, the Israelis, who have one field hospital, somehow locked up the soccer field in Haiti, and within 48 hours or 72 hours, they had a full field hospital out there. I can't get Doc 1 in the country yet. But that relationship that they had made a huge difference as well. So there were some great stories about a situation where an awful lot of people want to help. How do you work it together? And I think we can do a lot ahead of time with respect to that. The last example that I'll spend a little time on, because I just found it so moving, is Japan. Intimately involved in that because we have, first of all, we have a lot of forces there. Secondly, they're a great ally, and we really wanted to help as much as we could. And then I went there a few weeks after the tsunami just to survey it from the air. What I was struck with, and this goes to the culture issue, what I was struck with was the dignity, the class, the patience. It's really an Oriental ethos, quite frankly, that I learned in 1969 when I first went to the Western Pacific to fight in the war in Vietnam, but also visit those people and become, just enamored with their culture and their ethos. And it was that patience and that calm and that grace that gave that country an ability to respond in a way to this crisis of proportions that we just couldn't imagine. And this again gets back to the whole culture piece. It also fostered a huge change in the Japanese Defense Force, which has been clearly under a great deal of pressure since World War II because they did so much. And what militaries do, it happened in Haiti, it happened in Japan. The worry is that we're going to come in and take over. I get that. I've been doing this for a long time. That certainly isn't the intent. But what we bring is we bring communications, we bring structure, we bring leadership, we bring organization, and we can provide security until it gets organized. We also have relationships. In Haiti, the senior military, UN military officer was an individual that the senior U.S. military officer had gone to school with in Brazil at the Brazilian War College. So that just covered miles instantly that we didn't have to cover because we had that relationship. So there are, how do I look at the future with respect to this? And this was discussed. I don't think we're very good at it. In particular, vulnerabilities and what are the risks. From my perspective, there are very few organizations whose livelihood depends on accurate risk prediction. In a very uncertain world that we are not going to be very good at predicting where resilience is both needed as well as where things might happen. But how we evaluate risk, how we literally engage people who do this for a living so that we can really understand what risks are. And there are lots of vulnerabilities that I see out there. And David, you pointed this out. It was mentioned earlier today, short-term versus long-term. I actually, if I were in a leadership position, I'd say we need to get in this for the long-term. The short-term it's such a focus, it almost takes care of itself. You almost can't not do short-term because of who we are, what we've become, and how we focus over the last 20 or 30 or 40 years. You've got to emphasize the long-term. We're incredibly vulnerable with respect to energy. And not a lot of people talk about this. We're incredibly vulnerable with respect to water. Some would argue more so than with respect to energy. Clearly, food shortages throughout the world. I was intimately involved in H1N1 because of the threat, and I have literally not heard the word pandemic in 2 or 3, however long it's been, Larry. And it was a huge scare, and as someone said earlier, that really is spring training for what's out there. The issue of nuclear proliferation, the issue of cyber and cyber warfare, and it doesn't even have to be warfare, but the whole issue of cyber and intellectual property, and what does that mean as China continues to grow. What is going to happen in the Middle East with the Arab awakening. We're long past spring at this point. And we, from my perspective, have moved out of the ability to sort of control outcomes. We are in a position now to influence things, not control them. And I think we've got to pay a lot of attention to that. Nobody talks about Africa much anymore, and I just think there's an enormous amount of potential both on the upside and the downside. And my view is, and I lived in Italy in 2004, and I was moved by certainly the coastal countries in the Mediterranean who are extremely concerned about Africa, and that an awful lot of what's going on in Africa comes north and then comes west. And it's my view we can either engage it there in ways where we can help solve problems, or it's going to show up on our doorstep. What do we do as a country that uses, I believe, a value-based system? And first of all, what are those values? And how do we deal in the future with the whole issue of corruption? Corrupt governments, corrupt people, corrupt organizations, and historically we've just sort of tried to figure that out, catch as catch can. It is such an issue of losing faith with their governments that people have all over the world, and then we undermine ourselves by dealing with those corrupt officials. An increasing concern, again, these are vulnerabilities, an increasing concern of the split, the growing difference between the haves and the have-nots. I've seen more discussion about that throughout my life. It was always discussed in other countries. I see more of it here in my own country now than I have, best I can recall, in my adult life. What are we going to do about the urban explosion and the consumers that are in China? I was at a dinner the other night with Jeff Immelt, GE, and said, well, it's interesting to have the discussion we're having about the Chevy Volt in America, and of course taking it off the market here. The vote's going to happen with 4 or 5 or 6 or 700 million Chinese on electric cars, and that vote is already out there, which speaks to the whole issue of consumers in the future and the impact that we're going to have. Key to the future, and I think this has to be looked at, is education. Education in this area, but just education globally, not least of which is education in our own country. And we've been talking about a broken education system in our country, I don't know, for the last 20 or 30 years, and I actually believe at some point it is going to be the boiling frog that you talked about today to really jump up and bite us. And we will lose our competitive advantage as a country if we lose that. I'm loath to get up in front of an audience and not talk about the 40,000 people that have died in Mexico in the last 5 or 6 years, and the drug war. And again, in the majority of my adult life, fought that problem, not made much progress, particularly as a consumer that we are. And that's something that is a neighbor. That's not far away. That's right next door. There are, in addition to vulnerabilities, tremendous opportunities. Emphasis on people, from my perspective, focusing on communities. That's where an awful lot of answers are. The relationship piece. I think we're more globally linked economically than we think we are, and I heard a great word today, and that is that the disturbances that occur as a result of that linkage are amplified, and I think more so than we realize in terms of that linkage. Public-private ventures, NGOs and government, we've got opportunities. We've got to, I think, base it on principles. We've got to base it on facts on the ground. David mentioned this. I would foot stomp this. This is in my elder years, but we are so far off the talent pool by not employing women to their full capability. It is ridiculous. I see it time and time and time again. This isn't a gender issue for me. This isn't a social issue for me. This is a talent issue. We don't have time to just kind of continue to upgrade ourselves one step at a time. We have got to figure out to get it right in our own country and to embrace that globally so that that talent pool can take advantage of the potential that's there to make a difference. There's an opportunity in the media and social media. How do you build the prevention in? How do you build the prevention in? And how do you build the kind of depth and redundancy? So lastly, I do try to think about principles. Balance, since we don't know exactly what's going to happen. I think we have to place more than one bet. Education, make it preventative, make it for the long run, make it values-based, make it inclusive, collaborative, base it on people, make sure we look at the culture, don't just do it in a crisis, look at risk, trust, and relationships. I've had, as David said, I've been retired 6 months. It was a privilege of a lifetime to lead the 2.2 million men and women who make up our military, active and reserve. They are extraordinary, best we've ever had. They've done what we have asked them to do. And that privilege is something that I will always remember and just feel it's a great opportunity that this great country has provided someone like me to be able to do that. Thank you.
A few questions. I also have some questions that I've gotten from those who are following us on Facebook and Twitter. So I can lead off, or I can give any of you who have a question for Admiral Mullen the chance to have the first word.
Jeff Anderson, Smart Growth America. Really enjoyed your comments. I guess I just see such a contrast between your kind of clinical analysis of the long-term threats that face us and the need to address them over a long period of time and the political discourse that we have in the country. I wonder if you can offer any words of wisdom that might get the political leadership on the same page with actually addressing the challenges that are setting us off a cliff over the mid to long term.
Words of wisdom in Washington are very scarce. I mean, I've been in Washington most of the last 10 to 15 years, and I think as many Americans, I'm just extraordinarily concerned about the polarization, and I worry that it will take a crisis of significant proportion for us to figure out that it's got to change. That there are people throughout the country that I talk to that voice, I mean, almost unanimously, consistently with what you said, and I think I don't know how to answer it in terms of it's going to require leaders from every venue and every single part of who we are to step forward and make tough decisions and lead. That's what I believe. And somehow we have to filter out this response to the the 24/7 news cycle which is out there, which is, I think, more dominant than we realize in terms of an ability to do something or not do something. But I'm as concerned as anybody with respect to that. And in fact, then I worry that we're on a path where one of those threats creates a crisis which makes us change. And I think intellectually a lot of people get that, but I'm very worried that the chemical mix right now is not such that anything's going to happen, certainly based on what I've watched over the last several years, and I don't mean to point fingers at anybody, because I think it's pretty much everybody, and I worry a great deal that that the moderates, the centrists, are leaving, and I'll point specifically. I mean, Olympia Snowe. She wasn't the only one, but it's a huge concern I have as a citizen with respect to that. So I think it's going to take it takes the kind of leadership to knock heads and to make these kinds of things happen, and in what is a very difficult time, and needless to say, a very difficult year, just because we're in the middle of an election.
So this question, I would say, really follows from that. We just talked about what the role of government is and the function or dysfunction of government. But what do you think the role is of an articulate and informed public in moving the dialogue forward and moving the needle on resilience? This is from one of our followers via Twitter from California.
Well, I think the public has to, I talked about earlier, I think the community-based piece of this is central. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it all the way up to the national level, but I think that if you build it there, it will come together in a way that would force Washington to recognize it. I mean, I'm a big believer in our system. We elect people to go do this, and I think we need to put people in that will do this, and if they won't do it, somebody else should stand for that office and be elected. That's the system. I don't know how long we have to wait before that kind of thing happens in order to make the change that everybody talks about, or just about everybody talks about. So and then in the place I've watched government over the course of the last 2 administrations grow dramatically, and I've been in government, and we're not the most efficient outfit that I've seen. That's one of the reasons I kind of like the public-private venture, because I think individuals that are investing on the private side do it with a different view in terms of outcomes to try to get focus on the right kinds of issues. I think we should have a discussion about what the role should be, and having those kinds of in-depth discussions that are, reasonable debates, people of different views, is critical. It's always been a great strength of our country. I worry that many of those are they're just drowned out by the hysteria that comes by way of the polarization which exists right now.
Excuse me, Mike Lesnick, Meridian Institute. Chairman, I wonder, given the principles that you outlined and your experience to date, and as you look ahead, has this caused you to think differently about security and stability, both from an American perspective and globally? And secondly, what do you think a role of philanthropy could be, like from RF, since we're here, as you look at the next couple of decades? So first, your notion about security and stability, given everything you've talked about and looking ahead, and then maybe the role of philanthropy in that context.
I go back to my first days when I was a young officer and went to Vietnam, went to Hong Kong. My first port visit was in Hong Kong, and I, as I landed, got off the boat, there was this little tin hut that was nailed to the quay wall there with a family of 14 living in it. I had never seen that in my life. It was the first sort of visible have and have not to me, and I'm 23 years old. And what I took away from that family was a desire to have a better way of life, to have a higher standard of living. I've seen that as a consistent goal. Families all over the world from 1969, when I first saw that, to as recently as late last year. That's an enduring goal. You need to do that you can do that in a growing economy, in a peaceful environment. So, and then we have transitioned, we've said this for a number of years, it's just become very real, from a time where the United States it's not unipolar, it's not bipolar, it's not unipolar. We're still transitioning out of that, so we can't do it alone. I think we need to base our future with respect to security and prosperity on the health of let's say, the major economic engines in the world, Brazil, India, China, U.S., Europe, Middle East, et cetera, out of which there are tremendous opportunities to essentially achieve that goal for those families. And if we don't do that, the opposite, will continue to happen. So stability is absolutely critical, but the U.S. can't provide it alone. I also think, at least my travels globally are, that the United States is still a critical leader in the world. There's an expectation that we lead whether someone loves us or hates us. There's an expectation that we lead. And I think what we've been through in the last several years in terms of the financial crisis and what happened has raised the question about who we're going to be in the future. So I think, I've said it more than once, I think the most significant threat we have to our security is to get our financial house in order. We need to do that. And then secondly, we need to be able to work with these other engines, if you will, to provide a foundation for this, for growth and security and prosperity. That's a totally different way of thinking about security compared to where we've been in the past. And it is not provided solely by the United States military. I mean, we've, my view, done too much of that over the course of the last decade. There was a requirement to do it. I understand all that. We made some decisions coming out of the end of the Cold War that, quite frankly, devastated the State Department. And we're going through a big discussion right now. Bob Gates and I, more than once, said, spend more money in state. You know, on the military side, I don't want to be leading it. I want to be following our diplomacy. So I think, but it's very difficult in these economic times to have a discussion about spending money overseas when we're struggling so much at home. So we've got to be able to arrest that, to bound that debate or bound that discussion to make sure it doesn't spiral too far in the wrong direction.
One last question.
Just actually, following up on that, maybe if you could go into a little more detail about how we work with China, because there are some who think that, of course, the last century was the American century. This next century could be the Chinese century, and certainly 1.3 billion people going through the industrialization, motorization process means big changes in economics, in military power around the world, as well as environmental consequences. So how do we deal with that constructively moving forward, realizing that it could be a Chinese century, or, as Ian Bremmer pointed out, China could face serious complications to its development and therefore to world economic security and military security?
My answer to that would be to work with them, and you said it, constructively. And we've got to figure out a way to do that. And actually, we've done a great deal of that, certainly economically, financially, which goes back to what I said earlier. That's foundational from my perspective. I think we can work with them militarily. We have a very, very nascent relationship with them. And it's got to be sustained, and there's a tendency they have to turn it off every time we sell arms to Taiwan. We can't, and the whole issue of Taiwan, what Americans oftentimes don't understand is how sensitive that is. If you're in Beijing or if you're in mainland China, you just think Taiwan's another province. And so it is very difficult for Chinese leaders to have a discussion with their people in any way, shape, or form about why we're selling arms to Taiwan. I actually understand that. I understand our responsibilities to Taiwan as well. We've got to figure out a way to work through that peacefully. It's going to take them a long time to develop militarily in some areas. In other areas, they're right up there on a leading edge. There are two existential threats that we have in our country right now. One is the nukes with Russia, and that is well controlled with the treaties that we have. And the other, from my perspective, is cyber. And cyber is something that we need to all know a whole lot more about. Line leaders, not just in the military, line leaders in every way you could think about that. The military, government, on the commercial side, because there's an extraordinary amount of cyber attacks that you've read about, stealing, which is going on, and quite frankly, most of that is to focus on that economic engine that China needs to stay growing at 7 or 8%. They're on a bicycle. If they fall off that bicycle, that is a real problem. And so I would argue that it would be in our interest to make sure they don't do that while at the same time, they are more responsive to the needs that we have in our own country to develop our own economy. So I'm not somebody that signs up that it's got to be a Chinese century or a U.S. century. It needs to be a century for the people of the world. We can make that happen if we get it right between our countries as well as, again, these other economic powerhouses.
What a fitting ending. Please join me in thanking Admiral Mullen again.
Thanks.